The ascension of the young emperor was marked by ritual and ceremony, yet beneath the ornate robes and golden insignia, a dangerous instability quietly asserted itself. His father, a ruler of relative moderation, had died suddenly, leaving a 14-year-old boy to inherit absolute power. Advisors, ministers, and generals had once been confident in the continuity of governance, but within months, the delicate balance of courtly life began to fracture under the weight of a sovereign whose impulses were unpredictable and often cruel. The palace itself, once a place of order and hierarchy, became an arena in which fear was as carefully administered as law. Contemporary records, fragmentary though they are, describe incidents that historians later recognized as early manifestations of his cruelty. Servants accused of minor errors, misplacing a ceremonial robe or failing to bow at precisely the right moment, were subjected to punishments that were at once symbolic and psychologically devastating. One chronicler notes that a young scribe, who had erred in recording the emperor's lineage, was paraded naked through the halls before being confined to a dark, windowless chamber for several days. Hunger, exhaustion, and isolation became instruments of governance, ensuring that even the most powerful courtiers learned the precariousness of favor. The emperor's understanding of power was entwined with spectacle. Public humiliation was no longer merely disciplinary, it was ritualized. A man accused of disloyalty might be forced to wear a mask depicting a grotesque caricature of the sovereign, while the court observed in silence. The tension thick enough to choke. Punishments were both warning and theater, crafted to engrave the ruler's authority on memory through terror. Scholars have debated the purpose of these acts, questioning whether they arose from genuine paranoia, a conscious political strategy, or a combination of both. What remains clear is that the human cost was profound, and the court's compliance was sustained not by loyalty, but by fear. Those closest to him reported a subtle, almost imperceptible escalation. In the first year of his reign, the emperor would occasionally strike a servant with a cane, a momentary outburst that seemed to pass without consequence. By the second year, the acts became ritualized, and by the third, fear had become pervasive. Advisors spoke in whispers, masks of obedience pressed firmly into place, while the sovereign moved through the palace with a gaze that could reduce a man to trembling silence. Mistakes were no longer forgivable, and rumors suggest that even slight displeasure could result in hours, sometimes days, of psychological torment. The young emperor's methods extended beyond the palace. The city itself, a network of merchants, soldiers, and commoners, became a field in which his control was experimentally refined. Arbitrary edicts, taxes raised without warning, markets closed on whim, or citizens punished for unproven offenses, enforced a constant awareness of his reach. Historians have noted that while such measures might have seemed strategic, they also reflect an appetite for observation and manipulation. Those who crossed him were made examples of, their suffering meticulously recorded in palace archives and local annals alike. Each incident served as a reminder that power was both absolute and unpredictable, a duality that only deepened the city's collective anxiety. Psychological manipulation became as integral to governance as military or fiscal policy. The emperor seemed to take particular interest in watching how individuals reacted under duress, noting expressions, gestures, and whispered apologies. Servants learned to anticipate his moods, but even the most cautious courtiers could not predict the subtle shifts that would provoke a sudden and often inexplicable punishment. Letters sent to him were carefully worded to avoid perceived disrespect, yet even the most cautious wording could be interpreted as insolence. Paranoia, whether innate or cultivated, suffused his daily routine, ensuring that suspicion became a permanent fixture of palace life. The consolidation of fear was not merely a byproduct of youth or inexperience, it was, over time, a deliberate mechanism for control. By the end of the fourth year of his reign, scholars report that the court functioned less as an advisory body and more as a theater of obedience. Nobles, generals, and bureaucrats walked the corridors as though on a stage, performing loyalty while privately fearing the sovereign's caprices. Even the emperor's closest friends and family learned that intimacy could be weaponized, that affection was conditional, and that a misread glance or poorly timed jest might invite severe consequence. Historical accounts suggest that this climate of terror did not end with the palace walls. Punishments in the city and surrounding territories were sometimes public, intended to serve as enduring lessons. In one recorded instance, a merchant accused of tax evasion was displayed on the central plaza for 3 days, exposed to sun and rain, while guards delivered intermittent lashings. Such actions, horrifying in their meticulous cruelty, reinforced the narrative that the young sovereign's will was absolute and unchallengeable. Fear became both governance and legacy. By the close of his early reign, the young emperor's reputation for cruelty had begun to eclipse all other aspects of his rule. Scholars note that contemporaries often described him as inscrutable, capable of calculated acts of terror, yet exhibiting a childlike volatility that made predictability impossible. The line between policy and sadism blurred, leaving the court and the city in a constant state of tension. Every action, every glance, every rumor could trigger consequences of disproportionate severity. The early court of the young emperor was not merely a political institution. It was a theater of power and intrigue where every alliance carried the potential for gain or ruin. Yet among all the influences shaping the boy sovereign, none proved as potent or as unsettling as his mother. A woman of intelligence, ambition, and relentless political skill, she had long exerted control behind the throne, advising and shaping the young ruler's decisions. Historians note that her influence was initially celebrated. She was credited with guiding the inexperienced emperor through delicate negotiations, courtly etiquette, and the complexities of imperial administration. Over time, however, contemporary accounts suggest a troubling shift. What began as filial respect and admiration evolved into something far darker. The emperor's attention toward his mother became increasingly pronounced, his deference bordering on obsession. Courtiers and attendants, initially amused by the boy's excessive reverence, began to whisper of unnatural favoritism. Private chambers, once the domain of maternal counsel, became spaces where political and personal desires overlapped in ways that defied propriety. These whispers, recorded by later chroniclers, hint at a dynamic that destabilized not only the palace hierarchy but the moral framework of the family itself. Political ambition amplified the intensity of these unnatural affections. The emperor's mother was no passive figure. She recognized the power her son wielded and used it to consolidate her own influence. Marriages were arranged, rival factions subdued, and offices granted or revoked, often in alignment with her counsel. Yet the line between political maneuvering and personal exploitation blurred. Historians debate whether she was an enabler, a strategist, or a victim of her son's growing fixation, or perhaps some combination of all three. The resulting tension produced a palace where every interaction carried dual meaning, a gesture of duty, and a test of loyalty to the mother whose power had become inseparable from the emperor's desires. Rumors of inappropriate desire permeated the court. While direct evidence is scarce, multiple sources document the fear and unease that these suspicions generated. Servants and attendants observed long, private audiences, and the emperor's insistence on personal attendance from his mother for matters both trivial and critical. Courtiers speculated that the sovereign's attentions extended beyond political calculation, that a psychological dependence had emerged. These speculations, in a court already defined by fear and unpredictability, became a currency of power in themselves. An accusation, even whispered, could destabilize a family alliance, destroy reputations, or precipitate exile. The emperor's fascination influenced the selection of allies and rivals. Nobles who sought favor found themselves scrutinized not only for competence, but for compliance with an increasingly unsettling hierarchy of intimacy. Those who failed to anticipate the sovereign's needs, or who misread the intersection of political obligation and familial obsession, were swiftly marginalized. Historical records indicate that punishments were both subtle and overt: a sudden reassignment, a symbolic slight, or the strategic release of damaging rumors could ruin careers and families alike. Fear of crossing these intertwined lines of authority became pervasive, and the court's social architecture began to resemble a network of traps, each designed to reinforce the emperor's supremacy and personal fixation. The emperor's mother, meanwhile, leveraged this dynamic with calculated precision. She mediated disputes, orchestrated ceremonies, and controlled access to the sovereign, ensuring that her presence remained central to governance. Yet the psychological cost of this omnipresence was immense. Advisors later described the court as a place where conversation was measured, eyes avoided, and speech often rehearsed in advance. The combination of filial obsession and maternal strategy created an environment in which no one, not even family members, could act freely without incurring suspicion or censure. Even ceremonial occasions became charged with tension. The boundaries between familial duty and personal obsession persistently breached. As alliances shifted under this pressure, marriages and bloodlines themselves became instruments of ambition. Daughters and sons were married or betrothed less for affection or alliance than to cement control over palace factions. Nobles who had once wielded independent influence were opted through family ties or discredited through scandal. The emperor's preoccupation with his mother cast a long shadow, tainting familial networks and transforming them into tools for consolidating power. Historical accounts describe this as a period in which blood relations were inseparable from political calculation, and the lines between loyalty, desire, and manipulation were permanently blurred. The psychological and social consequences were profound. Courtiers and family members alike lived under constant scrutiny, aware that personal interactions could carry unforeseen consequences. Servants and advisors reported an unspoken terror that the sovereign's personal fixations could dictate the fate of entire households. Even seasoned diplomats and generals navigated the palace as though it were a labyrinth, where missteps could provoke punishment disproportionate to offense or invite a scandal whose echoes would linger for years. The erosion of natural familial bonds created a court in which fear and suspicion were inseparable from political life. By the end of this period, the emperor's fixation on his mother had entrenched itself as a defining feature of his rule. Scholars suggest that the combination of youthful authority, maternal influence, and obsessive attention created a feedback loop in which governance and desire reinforced one another. The resulting court was both highly efficient and profoundly unstable, its social and moral foundations compromised. What had begun as admiration and guidance had become a source of terror, poisoning alliances and altering the trajectory of the imperial family. If the shadows of the past fascinate you, and you crave more stories buried in darkness and mystery, hit that subscribe button now. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an ancient secret revealed. And if this story sent chills down your spine, drop a comment below. Tell me which part disturbed you the most. Also, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching from. I love seeing how far these dark stories reach. By the third year of his reign, the young emperor's palace had ceased to function as a seat of governance in any conventional sense. Instead, it had transformed into a meticulously organized theater of terror, a space where power was enforced through fear as rigorously as law. Marble halls, once intended to impress foreign dignitaries with the grandeur of the empire, became instruments of psychological control. The emperor's understanding of authority was inseparable from cruelty, and the mechanisms of intimidation were woven into every aspect of daily life. Historical records describe the treatment of servants and officials with chilling specificity. Minor errors, an improperly folded robe, a mispronounced title, a delayed message, were not merely corrected, they were punished through ritualized humiliation. Servants might be forced to crawl across polished floors, carrying the weight of embarrassment as courtiers observed in silence, understanding that any misstep could be fatal. Punishments were carefully calibrated to instill anxiety without immediate death, ensuring that the sense of precariousness remained constant. Hunger, sleep deprivation, and isolation were employed as instruments of discipline, creating an atmosphere in which obedience was inseparable from terror. Executions, when they occurred, were sudden and unannounced. One chronicler recounts an official who, after years of loyal service, was accused of plotting against the throne. Before any trial could be convened, He was dragged into the central courtyard and killed without ceremony, his body left exposed as a warning. These acts were not the chaotic result of impulse alone. They were deliberate displays intended to reinforce the omnipresence of the emperor's authority. Death became performative, a constant reminder to those who remained that proximity to power carried a perpetual risk. The psychological toll on palace inhabitants was profound. Contemporary letters and memoirs describe pervasive fear, paranoia, and the meticulous calculation required to survive each day. Courtiers learned to anticipate the emperor's moods, to measure every word, to conceal every emotion. Even those long accustomed to court life spoke of an oppressive anxiety that never lifted. Historians emphasize that the palace's horror derived not from spectacle alone, but from the subtle, constant manipulation of human behavior. Each act of cruelty, each unexpected punishment, reinforced a hierarchy maintained as much by dread as by law or tradition. Corridors, chambers, and audience halls all became stages for this psychological theater. The emperor moved through the palace as both participant and director, observing reactions, noting hesitation, and interpreting silence as either loyalty or threat. In this environment, trust was impossible. Alliances formed and dissolved based on minute shifts in behavior, and even the most careful servants could be accused of insubordination. Scholars note that the spatial design of the palace itself contributed to terror. Long hallways, concealed staircases, and hidden alcoves allowed the sovereign to appear unpredictably, ensuring that no one ever felt safe or secure. Ritualized humiliation became a key instrument of control. Officials and attendants might be forced to perform degrading tasks in front of peers, or to deliver public apologies for imagined offenses. Chroniclers record instances in which courtiers were required to kneel for hours, repeating scripted phrases of loyalty while guards enforced posture and gaze. Such practices were designed to break the spirit and ensure that obedience was internalized. The emperor's methods were psychological as much as physical, exploiting pride, fear, and social perception to consolidate absolute control. Paranoia defined the sovereign's relationships with his closest advisors. Ministers who had served previous rulers without incident found themselves under scrutiny, their every decision monitored. Subtle errors, a miscalculated expenditure, a delayed dispatch, or a minor breach of etiquette could trigger formal reprimand, confinement, or worse. Even family members were not immune. Courtiers recounted that the emperor's attention to his mother, combined with his obsessive control over the court, intensified the unpredictability of punishment. The line between political necessity and personal caprice was deliberately obscured, ensuring that fear remained the most reliable currency within the palace. Beyond the immediate court, the emperor's influence reached the wider city. Citizens and officials alike were aware that disfavor at the palace could result in sudden inspection, punishment, or public shaming. Tax collectors, soldiers, and bureaucrats learned to anticipate arbitrary decrees, often modifying behavior in advance of potential royal displeasure. Scholars describe this period as one in which the mechanisms of governance were inseparable from terror. The emperor's paranoia extended to every level of administration, creating a culture in which fear reinforced obedience and loyalty became performative rather than genuine. The emotional consequences of this environment were staggering. Chroniclers describe courtiers plagued by sleeplessness, anxiety, and dread. Individuals learned to suppress personal opinion, to internalize distress, and to perform loyalty with precision. Even those who attained favor understood that proximity to power was a double-edged sword. Admiration could quickly give way to suspicion, and confidence could be mistaken for arrogance. The palace became a crucible in which human psychology was tested, manipulated, and ultimately broken under the weight of absolute authority. By the midpoint of his third year, the emperor's reputation had become synonymous with fear itself. Observers noted that the palace's marble halls, though physically splendid, radiated an intangible menace. Guards, servants, and officials moved with calculated caution. Laughter and casual speech became rare. Silence was a protective shield. The emperor's paranoia and obsession with control had created a self-reinforcing system of terror, in which every action, glance, and word was scrutinized, and disobedience could result in immediate ruin. The young emperor's fixation on his mother reached its apogee with a union that defied both cultural and moral expectation. Historical accounts, though fragmentary and often censored in contemporary sources, record the formalization of a marriage between mother and son, a union ostensibly sanctioned by religious ritual and political precedent, yet undeniably rooted in personal obsession. The ceremonies were elaborate, priests recited prayers, the palace's altars were adorned with offerings, and ministers and nobles were summoned to witness a spectacle framed as legitimate governance. Yet behind the grandeur lay a reality so disturbing that even seasoned courtiers struggled to reconcile devotion with revulsion. Contemporary chroniclers describe the ambivalence of the court in precise terms. Attendees documented a mixture of awe, fear, and silent horror. The emperor's mother, previously a figure of strategic influence, became a symbol of absolute authority and an object of taboo desire. Observers noted that her role extended beyond ceremonial duties. She mediated disputes, directed policy, and exercised influence with unprecedented scope. Scholars suggest that her elevation blurred the line between maternal guidance and the exercise of political domination, reinforcing her centrality in a court already dominated by fear and obsession. The marriage itself was codified with the language of legitimacy. Priests declared the union blessed, invoking both ancestral and divine sanction. Documents from the period emphasize ritual propriety and spiritual justification, framing the alliance as a consolidation of dynastic power. Yet the subtext of personal desire cannot be ignored. Chroniclers, often writing with careful euphemism, hint at the emperor's attentions and the pervasive awareness of his obsession within the palace. The marriage became an instrument of governance as much as a declaration of passion, embedding personal fixation within the formal structures of state. Political consequences followed immediately. Nobles who might have opposed the union acquiesced, whether from fear of retribution or recognition of the mother's enhanced authority. Factions shifted, and long-standing alliances were recalibrated to accommodate the new hierarchy. The emperor's peers and subordinates navigated a landscape in which familial roles and political positions had become inseparable. Historians note that the fusion of family and state in this manner intensified the pervasive climate of anxiety. Those who had previously relied on customary structures of accountability now faced an unpredictable, deeply personal authority. The court's social fabric strained under the weight of the union. Servants and attendants, already subjected to psychological terror, now witnessed a dynamic that challenged both decorum and morality. Chroniclers document prolonged silences, measured speech, and subtle gestures of submission, reflecting the pervasive tension. Those who hesitated or displayed signs of disapproval risked censure or worse, reinforcing the principle that the emperor's desire, however unnatural, dictated not only private conduct but public order. Fear, already an instrument of power, was now intertwined with the perverse centrality of the sovereign's obsession. Religious sanction provided a veneer of legitimacy, yet it did not mitigate the ethical and psychological consequences. Scholars analyzing the period emphasize that the ritualistic framing of the marriage allowed it to be recorded in official annals, even as gossip and rumor circulated among observers. The paradoxical coexistence of sanctity and transgression created a pervasive cognitive dissonance. Participants and witnesses were compelled to recognize the emperor's authority, while simultaneously acknowledging the abnormality and horror of the union. Moral boundaries, once guiding courtly and familial interactions, were effectively suspended in service of power. The emperor's mother, elevated to a position of unparalleled authority, exercised influence with a combination of calculation and intuition. Her counsel now carried the weight of formalized partnership, and her presence became inseparable from governance. Historical accounts suggest that she exploited this position strategically, directing decisions, shaping policy, and consolidating her family's control over the palace. Yet her elevation also intensified the emperor's obsession, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which desire and power became indistinguishable. The palace itself became a reflection of this union, a structure dominated by both fear and fixation, where every interaction was imbued with the dual specter of authority and transgression. Outside the immediate circle of power, the empire's subjects perceived the union through a combination of awe and apprehension. Nobles, military leaders, and diplomats reported observing shifts in court dynamics that signaled the entrenchment of the mother's authority. Simultaneously, the pervasive sense of abnormality and taboo elicited murmurs of disquiet, both within and beyond the palace walls. Scholars argue that these perceptions, whether accurate or speculative, contributed to the broader understanding of the emperor's reign as one defined by both unparalleled centralization of power and the perversion of natural and social order. The psychological impact on those who served within the palace cannot be overstated. Chroniclers describe pervasive tension, anticipatory anxiety, and constant vigilance. Silence became a protective mechanism, while loyalty was performed with extreme precision. Mistakes were punished, hesitation interpreted as disloyalty, and any acknowledgement of moral unease suppressed. Within this environment, the emperor's personal desires were inseparable from mechanisms of governance, and the palace became a locus in which fear, obsession, and political calculation converged. By the conclusion of the early years following the union, the marriage had become emblematic of the emperor's rule. It symbolized the fusion of power and obsession, the subordination of morality to ambition, and the corruption of familial bonds. Observers, both contemporary and later, reflected on the union as a turning point in the empire's history, a moment in which authority, desire, and terror were fused into a single, indomitable force. By the 5th year of his reign, the young emperor's obsession with control had transformed the court into a labyrinth of intrigue and fear. Advisors who had once navigated the palace with confidence now moved cautiously, wary of hidden threats. Historical sources record a sharp rise in disappearances, sudden demotions, and unexplained deaths among officials. Some were removed quietly, vanishing into obscurity without ceremony or announcement. Others were publicly punished, their suffering meticulously documented as a warning to all. The palace had become a place in which survival required constant vigilance, and even those with established loyalty were vulnerable to the emperor's scrutiny. Poison emerged as both metaphor and method. Chroniclers note that cups of wine, meals, and medicines were often suspected of being tainted, though few accusations could be safely voiced. The threat was as much psychological as physical. Fear of betrayal eroded cohesion, and the shadow of uncertainty extended to every chamber of the palace. In parallel, metaphorical poison circulated through whispered rumors and carefully crafted insinuations. Officials learned that a single misinterpreted comment could destroy reputations, sever alliances, or precipitate exile. In this environment, every conversation was fraught with potential danger, and the line between loyalty and perceived disloyalty was rendered nearly invisible. The emperor's scrutiny intensified as his obsessions grew. He demanded reports on the behavior of his closest advisors, observing minute gestures and interpreting silence as either complicity or threat. Historical accounts describe meetings in which ministers were interrogated for hours, compelled to recount actions, words, and even intentions with painstaking detail. Those who faltered were sometimes punished immediately, while others endured subtle but unrelenting humiliation. Chroniclers emphasize that these interrogations were not solely administrative. They were exercises in domination designed to ensure that obedience was internalized and fear became habitual. Political alliances, once stable, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Families who had long served the crown found themselves divided as trust disintegrated. Marriages arranged for convenience became arenas of espionage, with loyalty measured by proximity to the emperor's attention. Rival factions emerged, each vying for favor while simultaneously guarding against betrayal. Scholars note that this environment mirrored the sovereign's own psychological instability. The empire itself was reshaped to reflect the emperor's obsessions, transforming governance into a network of personal fears and political calculations. Some officials sought survival through outward displays of devotion, attending ceremonies with exaggerated zeal and demonstrating allegiance in ritualized ways. Even these acts provided no guarantee Observers recorded instances in which a single misstep or a perceived lack of enthusiasm invited sudden reprisal. Chroniclers highlight the intensity of this pressure, noting that fear became a constant companion and that mental exhaustion was widespread. Officials who once enjoyed autonomy found themselves trapped in a system where every choice carried consequences, and even neutrality could be interpreted as disloyalty. Disappearances became a central instrument of control. Those who vanished often left no trace, their fates recorded only in passing in palace annals or in the fragmented memoirs of survivors. Others were made examples of, officials accused of plotting or simply failing to satisfy the emperor's exacting expectations were subjected to ritualized punishment that reinforced the omnipresence of fear. Scholars suggest that these acts were as much psychological as punitive, designed to instill a pervasive awareness of mortality and vulnerability in all who remained. The mechanisms of poison and intrigue extended beyond the palace. Envoys, generals, and regional governors reported that sudden changes in policy or unexpected purges reflected the centralization of fear as a governing principle. The emperor's personal obsessions dictated broader political strategies, and every decision, administrative, military, or ceremonial, was filtered through the lens of control and paranoia. The empire itself became a reflection of the court, a place in which suspicion and manipulation determined outcomes, and where trust was rare and dangerous. The cumulative effect of these practices was a profound erosion of social cohesion. Officials, courtiers, and servants internalized fear as a survival strategy, navigating the palace with caution and performing loyalty with precision. Even the emperor's inner circle, previously confident in proximity to power, experienced heightened anxiety, aware that favor could shift without warning and that misinterpretation could be fatal. Historians emphasize that the pervasive climate of distrust was not accidental, but a direct consequence of the sovereign's obsessive control and the use of intrigue as a governing tool. By the end of this period, the palace had become a crucible of psychological terror. Fear-dictated behavior, loyalty was conditional, and suspicion governed all interactions. Contemporary chroniclers observed that the emperor's obsessions had transformed the court into a mirror of his own mind, labyrinthine, unpredictable, and saturated with poisoned trust. Even those who survived carried the invisible scars of constant vigilance, the memory of vanished colleagues, and the anxiety of potential betrayal. By the 6th year of his reign, the young emperor's obsession with control had evolved into a systematic orchestration of cruelty. Historical accounts, often sanitized or fragmentary, reveal that punishments were not isolated events, but carefully planned spectacles designed to instill obedience and terror. Mutilations, floggings, and ritualized executions became central to the administration of power, transforming the palace into a stage on which human suffering was both performance and lesson. Chroniclers emphasize that these practices were not chaotic, each act was deliberate, calculated to reinforce the emperor's absolute authority while simultaneously eroding the psychological and moral resilience of those who witnessed it. Servants, officials, and courtiers were subjected to punishments that often began with humiliation and escalated to physical torment. One account details a chamberlain accused of misreporting revenue who was publicly paraded, forced to kneel upon sharp stones, and whipped before the assembled court. The physical agony was only part of the punishment. The exposure to peers and the sovereign's scrutiny intensified the psychological toll. Historians note that these acts served as both deterrent and demonstration. By witnessing the consequences of failure or perceived disloyalty, others internalized a persistent, paralyzing fear. Mutilation became a favored instrument of terror. Chroniclers describe instances in which hands were severed, ears removed, or tongues cut for offenses ranging from minor errors in ceremony to challenges to authority. These punishments, executed in carefully choreographed sequences, served to dehumanize both the victim and the observers. The court learned to associate obedience not with moral duty, but with the preservation of bodily integrity. Even those removed from immediate danger were affected psychologically, as each act reinforced the omnipotence of the emperor's will and the fragility of human flesh under his command. Executions, ritualized and public, functioned as apex displays of power. Historical records note that condemned officials were often displayed for hours before death, forced to endure humiliation and reflection on their misdeeds. In some cases, methods of execution were selected to prolong suffering, ensuring maximum psychological impact on witnesses. Chroniclers describe a pervasive awareness among the court that these events were both spectacle and warning. Every gesture, every cry, and every reaction reinforced the sovereign's dominance and the inescapable consequences of disobedience. The emperor's personal involvement in these acts was noted by contemporary observers. Reports indicate that he frequently attended punishments, observing minute details of behavior and reaction. This scrutiny was not merely voyeuristic, it was part of a systematic approach to maintaining authority. By witnessing and directing these spectacles, the sovereign reinforced his position as arbiter of both life and death. Chroniclers emphasize that this presence transformed punishment from administrative necessity into ritualized theater, in which human suffering was codified as a mechanism of governance. Beyond the immediate physical consequences, these practices had profound psychological effects. Courtiers and servants internalized a constant anxiety, aware that even minor infractions could escalate to grotesque punishment. Memoirs from the period describe sleeplessness, anticipatory dread, and pervasive tension. The repetition of cruelty normalized terror, reshaping social interactions within the palace and ensuring that fear dictated behavior more reliably than loyalty, advice, or custom. Historians argue that this environment represented a systematic erosion of humanity itself, as those who survived were conditioned to obedience through observation of suffering. The emperor's obsession extended to ceremonial precision in punishment. Each act was codified, framed by ritual and spectacle. Floggings were timed and measured, mutilations were conducted with exacting attention to order and visibility, executions were staged to maximize impact. This meticulous approach transformed cruelty into a form of artifice, linking the sovereign's psychological dominance with the formal structure of state authority. Observers, both contemporary and later, noted that the ritualization of suffering blurred the line between discipline and sadism, embedding terror into the administrative framework of governance. Political calculations intersected with these rituals. Punishments were often assigned not only for failure, but for perceived disloyalty, envy, or rivalry. Nobles and officials understood that proximity to the throne conferred both privilege and peril. Chroniclers recount cases in which minor infractions, misinterpreted actions, or whispered rumors led to ritualized punishment, reinforcing a culture in which self-preservation demanded vigilance, strategic subservience, and constant observation of peers. The palace became a microcosm of the emperor's obsessive control, where fear dictated decisions as much as policy or law. The cumulative impact of these practices extended beyond the palace itself. Envoys, governors, and regional administrators recognized that the mechanisms of terror were deliberate instruments of governance. News of punishment spread through the empire, ensuring compliance not solely through law, but through anticipatory fear. Scholars emphasize that this integration of psychological control with formal authority was unprecedented. Terror became inseparable from both political and familial structures, and the empire's stability was maintained through a combination of spectacle, manipulation, and coercion. By the 6th year, the emperor's reign was defined by ritualized cruelty as much as by dynastic consolidation or political strategy. Human suffering, carefully administered, had become a currency of power. The palace, once a center of governance and ceremony, now functioned as a crucible of fear, shaping behavior, loyalty, and thought through observation of violence and humiliation. Chroniclers remark on the pervasive moral erosion. Those who survived these spectacles were forever marked, both psychologically and socially, by the systematic orchestration of terror. By the 7th year of his reign, the emperor's obsession with control had escalated into full-blown paranoia. Historical accounts describe a sovereign who distrusted not only distant officials, but also those closest to him. Advisors who had once shared in the planning of policy, generals who had commanded armies in his name, and family members who had guided him in early years were now regarded with suspicion. Every council was scrutinized, every gesture examined, and every alliance weighed for signs of duplicity. The emperor's perception of threats became all-encompassing, and the court was forced to navigate an environment in which the very act of closeness was dangerous. The erosion of trust began with subtle acts of betrayal. Records indicate that advisors were removed from positions of influence without explanation, replaced by individuals chosen for loyalty rather than competence. Generals who had achieved success in campaigns were reassigned or dismissed, often under the guise of administrative necessity, though their removal frequently had no justification beyond perceived disloyalty. Historians note that these actions produced a cascading effect once trusted allies became wary of one another, each conscious that association with a fallen colleague could bring suspicion or punishment. Fear became the primary instrument of governance, eroding the bonds that had once supported collaboration. Family, too, was not immune. The emperor's mother, elevated and enmeshed in his obsessions, remained a figure of influence, yet even she was affected by the expanding paranoia. Siblings, cousins, and other close relatives learned that proximity to power could carry risk as acute as distance from it. Chronicles describe instances in which family members were accused of minor disloyalty, subjected to public reprimand, or removed from court, illustrating that suspicion had penetrated even the most intimate relationships. Trust, historically reinforced by blood, became a liability, and alliances that once defined the palace were dissolved in the shadow of fear. Isolation became both a necessity and a consequence. The emperor withdrew into private chambers, conducting affairs of state under intense secrecy and limiting access to the most trusted, or most terrified, servants. Courtiers observed that decisions once debated openly were now dictated in private, and those summoned to audience often did so under threat of reprisal. This contraction of contact amplified cruelty. With fewer moderating influences, the sovereign's obsessions intensified, and punitive measures were applied with increasing frequency and severity. The palace became a mirror of the emperor's mind, reflecting suspicion and cruelty in every hallway and chamber. The impact on daily life within the court was profound. Officials who had once spoken freely now measured every word, aware that even subtle inflection could suggest opposition. Ministers wrote reports with extreme caution, emphasizing loyalty over accuracy, and generals hesitated in decision-making to avoid misinterpretation. Historical sources note that this atmosphere produced a pervasive lethargy. The machinery of governance slowed under the weight of fear, and advisors prioritized self-preservation above strategy or statecraft. Psychological strain was ubiquitous. Mental health, as recorded in memoirs of survivors, deteriorated under the constant threat of accusation and punishment. Paranoia also altered the mechanisms of enforcement. Punishments became unpredictable, often targeting those closest to the emperor's circle. Courtiers who previously assumed safety through long-standing service were dismissed, humiliated, or executed. Historical accounts describe ministers who were accused of conspiracy based on rumor alone, their fate serving as cautionary examples for the remainder of the court. These actions reinforced a culture of isolation. Colleagues avoided intimate discussion, friendships became transactional, and alliances were fragile constructs maintained only for survival. The emperor's isolation had broader political consequences. Regional governors, military commanders, and foreign emissaries recognized the contraction of centralized decision-making and the increased role of fear in governance. The empire's stability depended less on strategy and more on the anticipation of capricious sovereign judgment. Scholars observe that such isolation concentrated power while simultaneously weakening the efficacy of administration, producing an environment in which terror, rather than competence, dictated outcomes. The court's horror was mirrored in the empire itself, as uncertainty extended from palace corridors to provincial provinces, and fear became a structural element of governance. Cultural and psychological observations from the period emphasized the transformation of interpersonal dynamics. Silence replaced debate, caution replaced initiative, prayers replaced strategy. Chroniclers repeatedly remark on the eerie quiet of council meetings, the measured speech in corridors, and the pervasive tension in ceremonial spaces. Even those previously confident in influence were reduced to survivalists, navigating a court in which proximity to the sovereign brought peril and distance brought irrelevance. The emperor's obsession with control created a feedback loop. The more isolated he became, the more extreme his demands and punishments, reinforcing both fear and estrangement. By the end of this period, the emperor had few genuine allies. Trust had been extinguished within the palace, leaving a court governed by anticipation of punishment rather than mutual obligation. Those who survived were haunted by the disappearance or downfall of friends and family, acutely aware that any position of favor was tenuous. Historians note that this transformation represented a profound psychological conquest. The emperor had succeeded not only in consolidating political authority, but in reshaping human relationships, rendering fear inseparable from daily life. By the 8th year of his reign, the emperor's obsession with control had reached its most intimate and horrifying expression. Historical records suggest that the culmination of his paranoia and desire manifested in an act that combined both ritual and murder, targeting the very person who had shared in his ascent to power, his mother. Contemporary chronicles, often fragmentary but consistent in detail, recount how she was lured into the private confines of her personal bath under the pretext of ceremonial cleansing and relaxation, a routine framed as both ritual observance and maternal care. Yet beneath the guise of ritual lay meticulous planning and calculated cruelty. Accounts indicate that the bath chamber was prepared with deliberate intention, blending the language of ceremonial propriety with instruments of death. Guards were present, positioned to ensure that no interruption would prevent the execution of the plan. Chroniclers note that the mother entered under the assumption of safety, unaware that her environment had been transformed into a controlled arena for ultimate betrayal. The intimacy of the setting amplified the horror. A space traditionally associated with purification and reflection became the stage for a meticulously orchestrated act of violence. The act itself, as recorded, was both swift and deliberate, demonstrating the emperor's willingness to subordinate personal bonds to obsession and fear. Details suggest that the method employed left no doubt of premeditation. The victim's vulnerability was absolute, and the betrayal was enacted in the most private and controlled manner possible. Chroniclers describe the psychological shock inflicted on witnesses and surviving members of the court. The realization that the emperor could turn the sanctity of familial intimacy into an instrument of death undermined any sense of security. Trust, once foundational, was obliterated in a single, calculated act. The motivations inferred from historical accounts are complex. Scholars suggest that the act was driven by a combination of paranoia, desire, and the consolidation of unchallenged authority. The mother, despite her political acumen and influence, had become a potential threat in the sovereign's perception. Her counsel, her knowledge, and her presence could inspire loyalty that competed with or undermined his own authority. At the same time, the act demonstrates a perverse assertion of control over personal and familial bonds, transforming a relationship previously defined by mutual dependence into one governed entirely by fear. Eyewitnesses, few and fragmentary, recorded the immediate aftermath with visceral horror. Servants and attendants, typically conditioned to endure cruelty as a means of survival, were confronted with an event so intimate and personal that it disrupted their assumptions of predictability. Chroniclers emphasize the profound psychological impact. Those present were forced to reconcile the ritualized sanctity of domestic and ceremonial spaces with the violent assertion of absolute power. The bath, a space historically associated with cleansing and renewal, was now inseparably linked to death and betrayal. The consequences for the court were immediate and far-reaching. With the removal of his mother, the emperor's isolation intensified, and his absolute authority became uncontested. Advisors and ministers, already cautious, interpreted the act as both a warning and a lesson. Proximity to the sovereign, regardless of prior favor or familial connection, carried inherent risk. Scholars note that this episode marked a turning point in the empire's political psychology, as fear, suspicion, and recognition of lethal vulnerability became omnipresent in both governance and personal conduct. Historical analysis suggests that the act had profound symbolic resonance. The subjugation of blood ties to paranoia and desire exemplified the emperor's methodology, authority asserted through calculated terror, human bonds subordinated to obsession, and morality reframed in service of survival and control. Chroniclers record that this incident was discussed in hushed tones among courtiers, not merely for its brutality, but for what it revealed about the nature of power under a sovereign whose obsessions eclipsed both familial loyalty and traditional norms of governance. The methodical preparation of the act reveals an attention to ritualistic detail consistent with other documented spectacles of punishment. Instruments, timing, and ceremonial framing were deliberately employed to assert dominance and reinforce psychological control over witnesses. This consistency with prior acts of public and private cruelty underscores a pattern. The emperor's obsession with control extended into the most intimate spaces of domestic and political life, and he transformed these spaces into instruments for both terror and instruction. Long-term consequences for the palace were as enduring as they were chilling. Survivors of the court recorded heightened anxiety, amplified surveillance, and an intensification of obedience framed through terror. Even those with long-standing relationships to the emperor internalized the lesson loyalty, knowledge, or intimacy could be weaponized against them at any moment. Chroniclers emphasize that the psychological architecture of the palace was fundamentally altered. The sanctity of familial and private spaces was irrevocably compromised, and fear became embedded in every aspect of courtly life. Beyond the palace, the act had repercussions for the broader empire. Officials in provincial territories, military commanders, and emissaries interpreted the event as both cautionary and instructive. The sovereign's willingness to subvert natural bonds of kinship signaled that power superseded all considerations of morality, ritual, or custom. Scholars argue that this episode contributed to the empire's climate of pervasive terror, reinforcing the principle that obedience was inseparable from fear, and that even the closest relationships could be rendered instruments of absolute authority. The psychological and political implications of the bath of death persisted long after the act itself. Survivors were left with enduring trauma. The court became a crucible of suspicion, and the emperor's reputation was cemented as one defined by obsession, cruelty, and an ability to subordinate all human bonds to his will. Historical records emphasize that this event was not an anomaly, but rather a culmination of a pattern of control that had intensified with each successive year of his reign. The bath of death exemplifies the intersection of personal desire, paranoia, and the calculated exercise of absolute power. Following the shocking act of matricide, the ripples of terror extended far beyond the palace walls. Contemporary accounts describe the immediate spread of disbelief and outrage among provincial governors, military commanders, and administrative officials. Chroniclers noted that while the emperor's public persona had long conveyed authority and control, the revelation of his private brutality disrupted assumptions of predictability and governance. Trust in the sovereign, once the foundation of imperial administration, was fractured irrevocably. Provincial officials recorded a climate of confusion and fear. Dispatches suggest that local governors hesitated in enforcing edicts, uncertain whether obedience would protect them or render them vulnerable to capricious retribution. Military commanders, previously loyal, debated among themselves the implications of serving a ruler whose most intimate bonds were subordinated to obsession and murder. Scholars observe that the emperor's personal actions directly destabilized political networks as fear replaced protocol and caution replaced initiative. The machinery of empire, reliant on trust and cooperation, was faltering under the weight of terror. Whispers of rebellion and conspiracy proliferated rapidly. Historical records indicate that minor uprisings, while largely suppressed, emerged in regions distant from the capital. Couriers carried news of secret assemblies, plots, and negotiations between disaffected officials and local leaders. The emperor's inner circle, already riddled with suspicion, became a breeding ground for intrigue as survival instinct collided with ambition. The pervasive uncertainty made loyalty difficult to maintain. Ministers feared being implicated in plots, whether or not they existed, and alliances became increasingly transactional. The moral authority of the throne was shattered. Scholars examining the period note that the act of matricide represented a rupture not only in personal and familial norms, but in the ethical foundation of rulership itself. Religious authorities and ceremonial officials, who had previously legitimized the emperor's actions, now faced a crisis of conscience. Temple records and priestly commentaries suggest that debates over ritual and divine sanction intensified, with some clergy quietly condemning the sovereign while others rationalized the act as an extension of dynastic power. The ambiguity of moral response compounded the anxiety among administrators, who now navigated a landscape in which sacred sanction no longer guaranteed ethical clarity. Fear permeated the administrative and military structures of the empire. Chroniclers describe courtiers and advisors walking in tense silence, aware that misinterpretation or delay could lead to punishment. Instructions were carried out with exaggerated care. Actions and words were scrutinized not only by superiors but by peers as mutual suspicion intensified. Historians note that this culture of pervasive anxiety eroded cohesion, decisions were slowed, communication became indirect, and governance increasingly relied on obedience rooted in fear rather than competence or reason. The emperor's private monstrosity became a focal point for both gossip and political maneuvering. Reports indicate that courtiers, while outwardly displaying submission, engaged in clandestine conversations about survival, potential alliances, and even vengeance. The palace, once a locus of ceremonial order and strategic planning, transformed into a theater of anticipation, where the slightest gesture could trigger alarm. The consolidation of terror at the center of power amplified instability across the empire, as officials calibrated behavior not on principle, but on predictions of the sovereign's capricious will. Rebellions, though often small and swiftly quashed, demonstrated the fragility of authority under conditions of terror. Provincial uprisings, sometimes fueled by outrage at matricide, sometimes by opportunistic power struggles, revealed that the emperor's dominion was vulnerable to internal discontent. Military dispatches describe hesitant loyalties and the need for constant surveillance, as commanders balanced obedience with concern for personal survival. Scholars argue that these tremors exposed the limits of fear as a sustaining force. While terror ensured immediate compliance, it could not indefinitely secure the broader empire from instability or resentment. The psychological impact extended to the populace as well. Rumors of the emperor's actions, exaggerated or confirmed, fueled anxiety among common citizens, merchants, and religious practitioners. Chroniclers describe a widespread perception that morality, justice, and tradition were subordinate to the sovereign's obsessions. Even distant communities, relying on imperial authority for order, became uncertain of stability, as the moral and political example set by the emperor undermined confidence in established hierarchies and enforcement mechanisms. The cumulative effect of these developments destabilized the empire's foundational structures. Historians note that the intersection of personal obsession, public violence, and moral corruption produced a systemic crisis. Officials who might have acted decisively to maintain order hesitated, familial and political alliances disintegrated under suspicion, and the mechanisms of governance slowed under the weight of fear and uncertainty. The emperor's actions had transformed the court's terror into a structural feature of the empire itself. By the close of this period, it was clear that the empire was trembling, not only politically but morally, socially, and psychologically. Authority, once anchored in ritual loyalty and familial legitimacy, now rested on fear, coercion, and unpredictability. Scholars argue that the period following the matricide marked a profound inflection point. The consolidation of absolute power through terror had secured obedience in the short term, but undermined the very foundations necessary for the long-term stability of the empire. In the wake of matricide, the emperor's actions revealed a mind increasingly untethered from reason. Historical records detail a marked escalation in cruelty both in scope and frequency. Minor infractions, mispronounced words, overlooked duties, or perceived lapses in etiquette were met with punishments that were extreme, public, and meticulously designed to inspire fear. Chroniclers note that what had once been ceremonial reprimands or administrative discipline became increasingly ritualized and grotesque, transforming governance into a theater of terror. Citizens and nobles alike felt the reach of the emperor's obsession. Market inspectors, provincial governors, and palace attendants could be summoned to account for mistakes that ranged from trivial clerical errors to lapses in judgment. The methods of punishment were elaborate floggings, forced labor, mutilation, and sometimes execution were employed not only as retribution, but as public demonstration of absolute authority. Chroniclers emphasized the psychological impact witnesses internalized fear. Compliance was dictated by anticipation of suffering, and the line between legality and arbitrary cruelty blurred entirely. Ritualized punishments became central to the emperor's exercise of power. Accounts describe elaborate sequences in which offenders were presented before the court, subjected to humiliation, and executed with meticulous attention to timing and audience reaction. Each act was a carefully orchestrated display, blending ceremonial procedure with sadistic ingenuity. Scholars note that these spectacles were not solely punitive. They served as instruments of psychological conditioning, teaching observers that the sovereign's will was absolute and that disobedience, even minor, would meet consequences both immediate and severe. The city itself became a reflection of the sovereign's unstable mind. Chroniclers recorded widespread anxiety. Streets emptied at odd hours, market activities were subdued, and public spaces became quiet as citizens anticipated arbitrary decrees or punishments. Testimonies from this period emphasize the pervasive fear that infiltrated daily life. Even those far from the palace felt the reach of the emperor's cruelty. Rumors of ritualized torture and punishment spread rapidly, reinforcing a climate in which obedience was both survival strategy and moral imperative. Punishments were designed to maximize psychological effect. Floggings were conducted slowly, sometimes in repeated cycles to prolong suffering. Mutilations were strategically publicized to serve as warnings, and executions were staged to demonstrate both control and ritual precision. Chroniclers describe officials forced to witness the suffering of colleagues, family members, or servants, amplifying the impact of each act. The integration of spectacle with governance ensured that terror became internalized, guiding behavior as effectively as law or policy. The emperor's paranoia exacerbated these practices. No action, word, or decision escaped scrutiny, and the criteria for punishment shifted according to perception rather than objective offense. Advisors learned to anticipate not only mistakes but the sovereign's unpredictable reactions, calibrating every report, gesture, and recommendation to align with his volatile temperament. Historians observe that this environment reinforced a cycle in which terror justified itself. Fear of punishment perpetuated obedience, while obedience invited further scrutiny and escalation of cruelty. Chroniclers emphasize that the scale of suffering was extraordinary. Public squares, ceremonial halls, and palace corridors were all arenas for punishment. Citizens accused of theft, tax evasion, or dissent were treated with severity disproportionate to their offenses, their suffering carefully documented for both contemporaries and posterity. Nobles, despite privilege and proximity to power, were not spared. Missteps, real or imagined, resulted in humiliations or death. This blending of societal levels under a single system of terror demonstrates the totalizing nature of the emperor's control, in which no class was immune and no bond guaranteed protection. Historical sources further note that the psychological toll extended beyond immediate victims. Families of those punished were often implicated or coerced into participation, and surviving courtiers carried trauma that influenced decisions long after the events themselves. Chroniclers record instances of individuals rendered incapable of independent thought, anticipating punishment for imagined offenses, or obsessively monitoring others for signs of disloyalty. The emperor's methods created not only physical suffering, but enduring mental devastation, transforming society into a network of conditioned fear. The integration of ritual and cruelty had political as well as psychological objectives. Punishments reinforced the sovereign's absolute authority, deterred rebellion, and ensured compliance across administrative, military, and civilian spheres. However, historians note a paradox. While terror secured obedience in the short term, it also eroded the social fabric, diminished trust, and fostered anxiety that hindered governance and collaboration. The emperor's obsession with domination, unchecked by restraint, created a system in which fear became both a tool and an end, consolidating power while destabilizing human and institutional relationships alike. By this stage of his reign, the emperor had perfected the orchestration of terror. Punishment had become a ritualized extension of his will, enacted with precision, and intended to produce maximum psychological effect. Chroniclers emphasize that the city itself seemed haunted. Every street, every court, and every public space bore the imprint of fear, as citizens internalized the lessons of suffering and compliance. Humanity, in both victims and witnesses, was subordinated to ritual, spectacle, and the unrelenting demands of an unstable mind. In the years following the apex of his cruelty, the emperor's influence continued to reverberate across both court and empire. Historians note that the immediate political and social aftermath was profound. Alliances fractured, governing structures destabilized, and administrative networks that once functioned with relative predictability now operated under pervasive fear. Ministers, generals, and advisors who survived the orchestrated terror were permanently altered, their decisions guided less by policy than by survival instincts conditioned over years of witnessing brutality. The psychological imprint of the emperor's reign extended to familial structures. Trust within the palace had been systematically dismantled, and kinship, once a source of security and political continuity, became a liability. Historians record that even after his death or removal from power, the court's collective memory preserved an enduring anxiety, the awareness that human bonds could be weaponized, and that proximity to authority carried an ever-present risk of betrayal or annihilation. Families within the palace and beyond internalized lessons of fear, ensuring that social interactions were governed by caution rather than loyalty. Political structures themselves were permanently altered. Governance, previously mediated through councils, advisory networks, and ritualized hierarchy, had been replaced by mechanisms of terror and obedience. Provincial governors, military leaders, and bureaucrats learned to rely on anticipatory compliance rather than consultation or debate. Scholars argue that this shift produced long-term consequences even as new rulers emerged. The empire's administrative framework remained haunted by precedent, conditioned to prioritize fear of reprisal over efficiency, justice, or ethical governance. Chroniclers emphasize the moral decay embedded in the emperor's legacy. Actions that had once violated ethical norms became normalized within the court, and the cultural memory of cruelty shaped expectations of authority. Public and private behavior alike were influenced by the emperor's systematic dismantling of morality. The notion that obedience justified extreme measures became a pervasive lesson. Subsequent generations, even those removed from direct experience, inherited a social landscape where trust was provisional and ethical compromise was a means of survival. The enduring horror was not limited to physical acts. Psychological trauma persisted for decades. Officials and citizens alike bore the invisible scars of terror, fear, and the memory of ritualized suffering. Chroniclers recount that even distant provinces reflected a climate of apprehension. Citizens moderated their behavior. Officials preemptively aligned with perceived favor, and communities internalized lessons of power exercised without constraint. The emperor's personal obsessions had created structural fear, institutionalized across the empire, and transmitted culturally through observation, rumor, and historical record. Historians consistently identify him as a figure whose actions epitomized the dangers of absolute power coupled with personal obsession. His cruelty, paranoia, and manipulation of human bonds illustrate the fragility of morality when authority is concentrated without checks or ethical restraint. Chroniclers interpret the period as a cautionary paradigm. An empire, a court, and a society can survive external threats, but internal corruption, rooted in obsession and cruelty at the top, can dismantle institutions, erode trust, and leave generations psychologically scarred. Even architecture and ceremonial spaces bore witness to his tyranny. Palaces once designed to reflect imperial grandeur became memorials to fear. corridors echoing with whispered anxieties and public halls associated with ritualized punishment. Cultural memory embedded these structures with cautionary symbolism. Each site, each ritualized space, reinforced the lessons of obedience enforced through terror, demonstrating that the emperor's influence extended far beyond his physical presence or lifespan. The legacy of his reign also influenced historiography. Chroniclers, writing decades later, framed the emperor as a study in human depravity, obsession, and moral collapse. His actions became the benchmark against which subsequent rulers were measured, both as warning and exemplar of the extremes of power untempered by conscience. Scholars analyze his life as a cautionary tale. Absolute authority, when entwined with personal obsession and cruelty, yields not merely administrative dominance, but profound societal and psychological destruction. Ultimately, the emperor's shadow lingered long after his reign ended. Administrators, families, and citizens alike navigated a world conditioned by terror, suspicion, and the systemic destruction of trust. Every act of governance, every personal interaction, carried echoes of past cruelty, ensuring that fear remained a constant, if invisible, governing force. The empire, though physically intact, was forever marked by moral and social corrosion. Modern historians, centuries removed from the emperor's lifetime, continue to confront the overwhelming evidence of his reign with a mixture of awe, revulsion, and analytical scrutiny. Archival documents, fragmented court chronicles, and surviving letters provide a detailed, though harrowing, portrait of an individual whose personal obsessions reshaped an empire. Scholars emphasize that the significance of his reign is not solely in the extraordinary acts of cruelty, but in the structural and psychological consequences that followed. How fear, paranoia, and obsession permeated every level of governance, society, and familial relations. The emperor's manipulation of power offers profound lessons on the fragility of human morality when authority is concentrated without checks. Chroniclers consistently note that the subversion of trust and ritualized terror were not anomalies, but systematic elements of governance. Minor transgressions, real or imagined, became justification for extreme punishments. Intimacy, whether familial or political, was perverted into tools of control. Scholars highlight that the emperor's reign illustrates a consistent pattern. When absolute authority is coupled with personal obsession, cruelty is not merely incidental, but a deliberate instrument of rule. Family, once a stabilizing force within dynasties, became a medium of corruption and psychological dominance. The emperor's relationships, particularly with his mother, demonstrate the lethal intersection of desire, power, and paranoia. Historical analysis emphasizes that the betrayal of blood ties was not merely personal but political, signaling to the court and empire alike that no bond could mitigate fear, and that loyalty was contingent on the sovereign's favor rather than ethical or familial principle. These acts destabilized not only the immediate court, but set enduring precedents for governance based on suspicion and terror. The psychological ramifications for the empire were extensive. Chroniclers and scholars alike record a society conditioned by fear, where obedience supplanted initiative, suspicion replaced trust, and the trauma of witnessing ritualized cruelty left long-lasting effects on administrators, military leaders, and citizens. Even after the emperor's death or removal, these effects persisted. Social behaviors were altered, institutional trust eroded, and the cultural memory of cruelty became a lens through which power and authority were understood. Historians argue that this demonstrates a crucial lesson: terror can enforce compliance in the short term, but it leaves deep, generational psychological scars that extend far beyond the immediate victims. The emperor's methods also offer insight into the nature of obsessive governance. Scholars note a pattern in which personal desires and paranoia dictated state policy, punishing errors or imagined slights in a manner disproportionate to their severity. This intertwining of private obsession with public administration produced an environment in which fear became codified, and human suffering functioned as both instrument and spectacle. Ritualized punishments, deliberate isolation of allies, and psychological torment were not incidental but essential components of his control, illustrating the dangerous capacity of a mind unrestrained by empathy, law, or moral consideration. Reflection on his reign also prompts unsettling questions about the human capacity for evil. Historians emphasize that the emperor's actions were neither the result of external coercion nor isolated circumstance. They emerged from deliberate choices, obsession, and the exercise of unchecked power. The combination of intelligence, strategic insight, and psychological manipulation with sadistic cruelty demonstrates the duality of capability. The same mind that can govern an empire can also orchestrate its terror. The enduring fascination with his reign is rooted not only in its historical extremity, but in its demonstration that ordinary human faculties, reason, intellect, authority, can be perverted toward destruction when guided by obsession and unrestrained power. The cultural and historical ramifications are similarly profound. Societies, both contemporary and later, observed the consequences of his actions and attempted to codify lessons regarding limits on authority, mechanisms of accountability, and safeguards against personal obsession dictating governance. Yet the very fact that historians continue to study his reign centuries later underscores a persistent truth: the human capacity for cruelty, when combined with structural power, produces consequences that outlive both the perpetrator and immediate victims. His reign, in essence, functions as a cautionary archetype for rulers and societies alike. Modern analyses also highlight the interplay between perception and narrative. Chroniclers and surviving documents, though composed with contemporary biases, reveal that the emperor's cruelty was both witnessed and feared. The enduring horror derives not merely from acts of violence, but from the systematic way in which those acts altered human behavior, moral expectation, and cultural memory. Scholars note that his reign illustrates a fundamental psychological truth: terror, once institutionalized, becomes a lasting lens through which authority and morality are interpreted, shaping social and political norms for generations. Ultimately, the emperor's story transcends its historical context, offering lessons on the intersection of psychology, power, and morality. Obsession, untempered authority, and the subversion of familial and social bonds serve as warnings of what can occur when personal desire outweighs ethical responsibility. Historians reflect on the interplay between human ambition and destructive capacity, emphasizing that such patterns are not confined to distant centuries, but remain instructive in any context where authority is concentrated and unchecked. Thanks for diving into the shadows of history with me today. Remember, the past isn't always buried quietly. Sometimes, it screams from the depths of time. Until next time, stay curious and beware what secrets lie beneath. See you in the next dark tale.